There is a moment, early in any great trade, when the position feels like a mistake. The price moves against you. The news is bad. The people around you, smart people, experienced people, begin to question you quietly. And then, not so quietly. You sit with the loss on paper. You sit with the doubt in your chest. And you begin to wonder whether you misread everything, whether you were simply wrong. I have lived in that moment more times than I can count. And I have learned something that took me far longer to understand than it should have. Being early and being wrong feel identical. From the inside, from the outside, they look the same. They feel the same. The discomfort is the same. The loneliness is the same. The silence from other people is the same. The only difference between the two is time. And time is the one thing that impatient people cannot afford to spend. I want to talk about this, not as a lesson, not as advice, but as something I have observed across decades, across markets, across human behavior. Something so consistent and so overlooked that it has become, for me, one of the quietest and most reliable edges I have ever found. The world rewards the appearance of certainty. It punishes the appearance of doubt. And because being early looks exactly like being wrong, most people abandon correct positions before those positions are ever proven correct. They sell at the bottom. They quit at the beginning of something great. They walk away from what would have become their best decision, not because they were wrong, but because they could not endure looking wrong long enough to be proven right. This is not a market phenomenon, it is a human one. I have watched it happen in businesses. A founder builds something that nobody understands yet. The market doesn't respond. Friends stop asking about it. Family members suggest he consider something more stable. Investors pass. And slowly, the pressure of being misunderstood, which is identical emotionally to being wrong, begins to erode his conviction. He pivots, he changes direction, he tries to build something more legible, more acceptable, more immediately validated. And 3 years later, someone else builds exactly what he originally envisioned, and it becomes enormous. And he watches it, quietly, from the outside. He was not wrong. He was early. But he couldn't hold the position. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes with being early. It is not the suffering of failure. Failure is at least legible. People understand failure. They offer sympathy, or silence, or occasionally wisdom. But being early is not failure. It is a position that has not yet been confirmed. It sits in a strange, uncomfortable limbo, too uncertain to celebrate, too possible to abandon, too quiet to explain to anyone who wasn't there when you made the decision. And that quiet is what kills most people. I have always believed that silence is underestimated as a form of discipline. Not silence as avoidance, not silence as fear, but silence as strategic patience. The willingness to sit inside an unconfirmed position, personally, financially, intellectually, without seeking external validation, without explaining yourself, without defending your reasoning to people who haven't done the work to understand it. When I first held a position that the market disagreed with, I made the mistake of explaining it. To colleagues, to analysts, to anyone who would listen. I thought that if I could just articulate my reasoning clearly enough, they would understand. They would wait with me. The discomfort would be shared and therefore easier to carry. It was not. Explaining a contrarian position to people who don't believe in it does not reduce your doubt. It multiplies it. Because now you have heard their counter-arguments. Now you have seen the skepticism on their faces. Now you carry not only your own uncertainty, but the weight of theirs as well. And their uncertainty is louder than yours, because it comes dressed in consensus. Consensus always sounds more authoritative than individual conviction. I stopped explaining. I held the position. And I learned something fundamental. The most dangerous moment for any correct contrarian belief is the period between when you form it and when the world confirms it. That gap, that painful, invisible gap, is where most great ideas are abandoned. Not because they were wrong, but because they were lonely. The world does not reward early thinking. Not immediately. It punishes it. It misunderstands it. It ignores it. And if you are the kind of person who needs the world to confirm you before you can feel confident, you will never be able to hold a position long enough to profit from being right. This is the first and most fundamental thing I want you to understand. Conviction is not the same as certainty. Certainty is a feeling. Conviction is a practice. Certainty says, I know I am right. Conviction says, I believe I am right. I have done the work to form that belief, and I am willing to sit with the discomfort of being unconfirmed until the world catches up. Certainty is comfortable. Conviction is lonely. And wealth, real, lasting, compounding wealth, lives in the house of conviction, not certainty. I have met many people in my life who were certain. They were certain at the top of markets. They were certain about investments they had not examined carefully. They were certain because everyone around them was certain, and certainty is the most contagious emotion in financial life. Certainty is how crowds form. Certainty is how bubbles inflate. Certainty is the feeling that arrives exactly when skepticism would serve you better. And I have met far fewer people who were genuinely convicted, who had done the quiet, unglamorous work of understanding something deeply, who held their belief not because it was popular, but because the work justified it, who could sit with the loneliness of being early without flinching. Those people, the convicted ones, are the ones who built things that lasted. There is something dark about human nature that I have observed, and I think it is important to name it directly. People are not simply indifferent to early thinkers. They are, in many cases, actively hostile. Not loudly hostile, not always consciously hostile. But there is something in the human response to a person who believes something that has not yet been confirmed that produces a quiet desire to see that person proven wrong. I do not say this with judgment. I understand the psychology. When someone holds a position you do not hold, when they believe something you rejected or overlooked or never considered, their correctness, if confirmed, implies your error. Not just in that specific decision, but in your broader judgment, your intelligence, your perception. And so the mind, in its quiet and self-protective way, roots for the early thinker to fail, not maliciously, but genuinely. This is why people who make contrarian calls are celebrated only after they're confirmed. Before confirmation, they are dismissed, ridiculed, or simply ignored. The hedge fund manager who shorted the housing market in 2007 was not celebrated in 2005. He was considered a fool. He was considered wrong. He held the position anyway. And the market eventually provided the confirmation that the world required before it would offer its applause. The applause is irrelevant to the decision, but human beings find it very difficult to act without it. I want to talk about what I think of as the shadow period. Every great investment, every great business, every great idea has a shadow period, a time before confirmation, a time when the thesis is correct, but the evidence is not yet visible, a time when being right feels indistinguishable from being wrong. The shadow period is where fortunes are either made or abandoned, and the length of the shadow period is directly correlated with the size of the opportunity. Small opportunities confirm quickly. The market absorbs them, responds to them, prices them in. There is little shadow because there is little distance between recognition and reward. But the largest opportunities, the ones that compound into wealth that lasts generations, those have long shadows, sometimes years, sometimes decades, because they require the world to change before they can be confirmed. And the world changes slowly and unevenly, and in ways that look from the inside like nothing is happening at all. Most people cannot live inside a shadow that long. The human need for validation is too strong. The social pressure of being misunderstood is too costly. The emotional weight of watching others confirm positions that look safer and feel more comfortable. That weight accumulates. And eventually, the position is abandoned. Not because the thesis was wrong, but because the shadow was too long to endure. I have sat inside shadows. I know what they feel like. They feel like mistakes. They feel like stubbornness. They feel like the particular loneliness of believing something that no one around you believes. And they feel, most powerfully, like an invitation to reconsider, like the universe asking, "Are you sure? Are you really sure?" Because everything around you is saying no. The answer, when the work has been done and the thesis is sound, must be yes. Quietly, without explanation, without the need for anyone else to agree. This is what I mean when I say that patience is not passive. People think of patience as the absence of action, as simply waiting. But real patience is active. It is the continuous, daily, sometimes hourly decision to hold a position in the face of disconfirmation. To not act when every impulse says act. To stay when every social cue says leave. That is not passivity. That is one of the most demanding disciplines I know. The tree does not apologize for growing slowly. It does not seek validation from the trees growing faster. It grows according to its own structure, its own season, its own depth of roots, and when the storm comes, as storms always come, the fast-growing trees bend and break. The slow-growing tree holds, because the roots are deep, even if they were invisible, especially because they were invisible. I have spent a great deal of my life being underestimated. Early in my career, this bothered me. I wanted to be seen clearly. I wanted my work to be recognized. I made the mistake of confusing recognition with accuracy. I thought that if my thinking was correct, people would recognize it as correct. I did not yet understand that recognition and accuracy are almost completely unrelated. A thing can be completely accurate and completely unrecognized. A thing can be wildly inaccurate and universally recognized. The market teaches this lesson eventually. Human history teaches it continuously. And once you understand it, really understand it, not just intellectually, but viscerally, your relationship with recognition changes entirely. Recognition is not the signal. The signal is the work. The signal is the thesis. The signal is the careful, honest, private examination of whether something is true, independent of whether anyone else believes it, independent of whether it is comfortable, independent of whether its truth is currently visible to the world. When I stopped seeking recognition for my positions, something interesting happened. The positions got better. Because I was no longer choosing what to believe based on what I could defend publicly. I was no longer avoiding uncomfortable theses because of how they would sound at dinner. I was choosing positions based entirely on what the work told me was true. And when you remove the social dimension from analysis, the quality of the analysis improves dramatically. The silent thinker sees things that the visible thinker misses. Always. Not because the silent thinker is more intelligent, but because the silent thinker is not managing perception while trying to think. Perception management and clear thinking are in direct competition with each other. You cannot fully attend to both at the same time. The mind that is thinking about how it looks is not fully thinking about what is true. This is why I have always been more concerned with being right than with being recognized as right. They are different goals, and they require different disciplines. Being right requires solitude, patience, honesty, and the willingness to be wrong in the process. Being recognized as right requires something else entirely: timing, presentation, social skill, and often a willingness to say things people are ready to hear, rather than things that are true. I have chosen, consistently, to pursue the former. And I have accepted as the cost of that choice a particular kind of invisibility, a particular kind of being misunderstood, a particular kind of existing in shadow. I do not say this with self-pity. I say it as a structural observation about how the world works. If you want to be understood early, you must say things the world already believes. If you want to be right early, you must sometimes say, or more often, think, things the world is not yet ready to believe. And the gap between those two positions is the price of genuine, long-horizon thinking. Most people are not willing to pay that price. Not because they lack intelligence or courage, but because the social cost is real and immediate, while the financial or intellectual reward is distant and uncertain. And human beings are deeply structurally biased toward the real and immediate over the distant and uncertain. This bias is not a flaw. It was useful for most of human history. When the immediate threat was physical and the future was genuinely uncertain, attending to now made sense. But in financial life, in the realm of compound returns, of long horizon thinking, of positions that take years to confirm, this same bias becomes the primary source of destruction. The thing that protected your ancestors now quietly destroys your portfolio, and more broadly, your capacity for long-term thinking in every domain. I have watched generations of investors fall to this, not to stupidity, not to laziness, but to the very intelligence and responsiveness that served them well in other contexts. The mind that is quick to respond, quick to update, quick to adjust, that mind is valuable in many situations. But in a market that rewards patience over reflexivity, that quickness becomes a liability. It sells the position at the bottom. It buys the hype at the top. It responds to disconfirmation with exit when it should respond with patience. The slowest correct mind often outperforms the fastest incorrect one. Over enough time, over enough cycles, with enough patience. The tortoise does not win because it is smarter. It wins because it does not stop. There is a practice I return to again and again throughout my life. When a position felt most uncomfortable, when the pressure to exit was highest, when the voices around me, inside and outside my head, were loudest in their doubt, I would go back to the original work, not to the current price, not to the current sentiment, not to what other people were saying. I would go back to the thesis, the original reasoning, the original work, and I would ask quietly and honestly, has anything changed that the original thesis depended on? If the answer was yes, if something fundamental had changed, then the discomfort was a signal. The position was not just feeling wrong, it was wrong. And the right response was to exit cleanly, without ego, without attachment to the original bet. But if the answer was no, if the thesis remained intact and the discomfort came purely from market noise, from sentiment, from other people's doubt, then the right response was to hold, or to add, to lean into the loneliness rather than away from it. This practice sounds simple. It is not. Because in the moment of maximum discomfort, it is very difficult to distinguish between a thesis that has broken and a thesis that is simply being tested. The feelings are the same. The doubt is the same. The noise is the same. The only thing that separates them is the clarity and honesty of the original work and the willingness to examine it without defensiveness. This is why the quality of your original thinking matters so much, not just for the initial decision, but for everything that comes after. A well-constructed thesis is something you can return to, something you can test honestly, something that will tell you, without ego, whether you are holding a broken position or simply an early one. A poorly constructed thesis, built on feeling, on trend, on social proof, cannot offer you that clarity, because it was never clear. It was just confident. Confidence without clarity is one of the most dangerous things I have ever observed in markets. It produces conviction without foundation. It produces holding without reason. It produces the particular disaster of someone who refuses to exit a broken position, not because the thesis is intact, but because they cannot separate their ego from the bet. I have tried never to be that person. I have not always succeeded. But the practice, the discipline of returning to the original work, of separating the thesis from the price, of asking what is actually true rather than what I want to be true, that practice has saved me from the worst versions of that disaster more times than I can count. Know the difference between being early and being wrong. This is perhaps the most valuable distinction in all of investing, in all of thinking, in all of human endeavor. Being wrong means the thesis was flawed, the reasoning was faulty, the evidence, examined honestly, did not support the conclusion. Being early means the thesis is sound, the reasoning is careful, and the world has simply not yet arrived at the place where it can confirm what you already understand. Both states are uncomfortable. Both states look similar from the outside. Both states attract the same skepticism, the same dismissal, the same quiet social pressure to change your mind. And the only way to tell them apart, the only reliable way, is to do the work and then do it again, and then do it again, and ask honestly each time whether the original foundation still holds. If it does, hold. Be silent. Be patient. Be willing to be misunderstood for longer than feels reasonable. Because here is what I have observed across every decade I have spent in markets, in business, in the observation of how wealth and ideas and reputations actually grow. The things that matter most take the longest to confirm. The investments that compound into generational wealth require the most patience to hold. The ideas that eventually change industries spend years being dismissed before they are suddenly obvious. The people who build quietly, without announcement, without validation, without the applause of contemporaries, those people arrive somewhere eventually that the louder, faster, more visible people cannot reach. Being early is not a curse. It is a filter. It separates the people who built their conviction on work from the people who built it on feeling. When the shadow period becomes too long, when the discomfort becomes too acute, feeling collapses. It always does. But work holds. A well-built thesis, honestly examined, does not collapse under pressure. It holds. And when the world finally arrives at the place where it can see what you saw earlier, you are still there. You held the position. You lived inside the shadow until the light came. And the light always comes. Not on schedule, not on your preferred timeline, not in a way that feels fair or proportional to the patience it required. But it comes. Markets eventually price what is real. The world eventually recognizes what is true. Ideas eventually find the moment they were waiting for. The question is only whether you are still holding when they do. I am still here. I am still holding. And the shadow, from where I stand now, was never as long as it felt from inside it.